Hello and welcome back once again to CBR MTG for the final time for our CANCON 2019 Highlander National Championships. I'm joined here by Philip Nicholson.
Hello there.
And we are doing the last round of the Swiss. That's round 7 of our Swiss Championships. Before we go into the top 8, all the videos besides this one are already been posted. Sorry it took a while, everyone. We, still got our day job, so we got to do what we got to do. But we're here with Dylan Kakawa on BR Aggro and Todd Youngs on Blue Moon. Phil, why don't you tell us about BR Aggro as our resident aggro player?
Sure. So BR Aggro is obviously an aggro deck, as the name might suggest. In Highlander, just trying to play out some loot of the ground creatures and finish your opponent off with a couple of burn spells here and there. It kind of perhaps a little unintuitively for what you might expect leans very heavily into the black side. It gets you some pretty powerful recursive effects and recursive creatures, and for the most part, all of the really powerful red effects that you want only cost 1 colored mana, whereas that's just not as true for the black effects. And we're seeing the deck get off to a pretty cracking start here with a 1-drop into a light up the stage, hitting a Mox, which is a pretty absurd start.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever seen in Magic's history a light up the stage getting a Mox and a Bayou so that they can cast their Dark Confidant. So multi-format staple already that light up the stage.
Yeah, Todd does have the electrolyzed answer though, so while that light up the stage did put in a lot of work in the card advantage game, we'll have to see if Dylan can recover from the huge tempo loss to having both of their X1s killed with 1 spell.
Yeah, that's quite the blowout for Dylan, unfortunately. So they'll have to keep going and hopefully get some small amount of card advantage here and there. Dylan is playing a couple of little bits and bobs to try and get card advantage, including Necropotence in the board, but it's not really this deck's main objective to gain card advantage. It's just basically kill your opponent with the cards you have in hand. Anything that you draw extra is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a piece of card advantage in that it's going to make Todd discard a couple of cards, but it's not a huge swing, and it doesn't necessarily advance Dylan's board state, and the 3 damage is only a little bit in the face of Todd's pretty healthy life total at this stage.
Yeah, and speaking of aggro decks, this is one of the dividing cards for Blue Moon players. A lot of people like to have the super control version where you play Torrential Gearhulk or Snapcaster Mage and Jace as your win con, maybe even a True Name Nemesis if you have the space, but Todd's opting for the Goblin Rabblemaster package where he might even be playing Legion Warboss or that sort of thing, but trying to play it sort of like a Delver deck where you're trying to stick 1 threat and then protect it with counter spells and follow it up with a bit of burn down the line.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for Goblin Rabblemaster because it really does demand an answer. It gets out of hand pretty quickly, kills in just 3 swings if nothing else goes on in the game, and it's going to crack in for 4 just on its first attack. For 6, 4 power itself, and then 2 from the extra goblins.
Yeah.
So, and it's pretty cheap, so it's not hugely unreasonable for a deck like this to be able to cast out a Rabblemaster and then leave a bit of mana open to protect it.
Yeah, absolutely. But Cryptic Command wasn't good enough to save the Rabblemaster, but it was good enough to counter that Liliana the Veil. So he will get to keep his Lonely Goblin token around, but I don't think Dylan is in any position to really care about that 1-1 for now.
No, I mean, Dylan can block it as much as they want to. It's probably more annoying in that it'll save Todd a few points of life down the line if Dylan can find a good opportunity to crack in with those creatures.
Yeah. It's probably the Goblins most likely just on defense. Not now. I think Todd's probably feeling not too bad. Dylan's only at 2 cards in hand. I mean, they do have Bell Striker and what was this other zombie as well?
That's a Diagraph Ghoul.
Diagraph Ghoul, so nothing too fancy, just a 2/2 for 1 that comes in the battlefield tapped. But yeah, it's the damage on board is something that Todd does have to deal with, but after he does that, he's probably okay to try and turn the game around in his favor.
Yeah, I think he's a bit more incentivized to block with the Goblin now, just because he's got the Planeswalker in play, and depending on what he does with the Jace, he's very likely incentivized to keep Jace alive if Jace is minusing here, or save Jace a bit of loyalty if Jace is going up or staying in 0. It does look like Todd is electing to go up with that Jace.
Seeing if we want to keep this card on top seems to be probably the best way to go about it, considering it gets Jace out of bolt range, and Dylan is kind of in the point where Todd can start actively controlling the top of Dylan's deck, but I think probably brainstorming now is probably just unnecessary. I mean, he can do it if he wants, by all means, but just keeping it out of range of dying next turn seems to be a pretty reasonable line.
Yeah, I mean, if you make Dylan commit an attack plus any 3 damage burn spell, that's kind of the worst case scenario if you're Jace here, but it's still getting you pretty similar card advantage to brainstorming and then having it die.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, so it's all pretty decent.
Yeah. Well, Dylan with no shortage of spells to cast with this Vampire Lacerator coming down. Still going to ping Dylan for a couple of damage here and there, considering Dylan's still at a very healthy life total at 18.
Well, Vampire Lacerator cares about your opponent's life total.
Oh, his opponent's life total. My apologies. So in that case...
It is still high enough that Lacerator will hurt Dylan in at least one upkeep.
Yeah.
Probably just the one. But
yeah. And Vampire Lacerator is a really good sort of show about what this deck can do, because that's the perfect deck for... that's the perfect card for this deck, because you don't really care about taking a life here or there, but you do care about having a 2/2 for 1.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a 2/2 for 1 with no downside. It obviously does have some downside, but you are playing one of, if not the most aggressive deck in the format, and so you're just not that incentivized to care about your life total in comparison to your opponents.
Yeah, and this is going to be such a blowout for poor Dylan, because we're going to use the Electrolytes to take out one of the creatures, and then Torrential Gearhulk to block the other one, and then suddenly Todd's got a 5/6 on the battlefield, and Dylan has nearly nothing.
Yeah, I mean, Todd's also managed to perform the Galaxy Brain play here, in that Dylan does actually have a copy of Neela the Blade Blossom in hand, and Todd has elected to kill both of the warriors that were in play with that Torrential Gearhulk, despite not having any idea that card is there.
Yeah. It's been the topic of discussion between yourself and other black-red aggro players about where you want to sort of skew the tribe, because this deck is basically half zombies, half warriors. Incidental warriors, as most warriors are, but you're playing the zombie game because of Gravecrawler particularly. And also, Sarcomancy kind of helps for that thing. It's just a 1-mana enchantment that makes a 2/2, and then if you don't control a zombie, you take damage. So you can play that sort of thing as well. But Nihila the Blade Blossom is definitely a reason to be trying warriors instead of zombies.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the deck does have space for both. It's just kind of a question of where your last couple of slots go. Do you want to play yourself a Diagraphical or a Sarcomancy, or do you want to play something like Tormented Hero? And I think they're both 2 power 1-drops with some kind of downside.
Yeah.
It's all pretty much the same in the long game.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunate about this Spawn. The Spawn getting bounced back to hand by this Mystic Confluence, because it's going to be a little bit harder to cast the second time around. We're just going to hard cast it here, which is fine, except for the fact that Todd's very prepared with this Mana Drain.
Yeah, well, drawing Mana Drain plus Counterspell when you have double blue open off your Mystic Confluence is a pretty good feeling. I imagine that Todd also has a bunch of cards in hand. If any of them, aren't just Counterspells, there's a lot of things that he might be able to string together on this turn.
Let's see if we can piece something together. He does have Fact or Fiction in hand as well, which is one of those.
As well as at least a Fiery Confluence that he's just drawn off that Brainstorm. So he's definitely got some things to do with that 4 colorless mana.
Mana Drain being one of the points in our wonderful 7-point Highlander format, just because it's incredible. Basically, a lot of decks can't really a lot of control decks don't really use the mana very effectively. Like sometimes you'll see a main phase Gomag Angler just a regular Gomag Angler or a main phase Torrential Gearhulk because you have that mana and you just want to use it. But I mean, strictly better than Counterspell in every way, you know?
Yeah, well, I think that's also just due to the current configuration of threats in the popular control decks, which are obviously Blue Moon and the Grixis control deck. They don't have too many ways to take as much advantage of it. But in the kind of the older or less popular style of like Esper decks, I've certainly seen and been inflicted with quite a few games where mana drain leads into something like a turn 3 Elspeth Sun's Champion, and that doesn't feel very fair.
Yeah, that's right. Making some seriously unfair decisions, especially when you counter stuff like your opponent's Gomag Angler or something that was cheated with mana with Delve and those sorts of things. It really makes your mana drain a lot more effective.
Yeah, I mean, even in just this situation, being able to cast a Fact or Fiction off of the mana drain means that there's a pretty small commitment in terms of Todd's lands that he's had to make into pretty much drawing 4 cards. Admittedly, a lot of them were lands that aren't super useful to his game plan at the moment, which is probably a large part of why he put them back with the Brainstorm, is he didn't really care where they ended up in the Fact or Fiction piles. They didn't, factor into much for him, but
he did see a Stifle and a Spell Snare out of the 2 non-land cards pulled off the top of the Fact or Fiction, and Dylan decided that the Spell Snare, like the lands at this point doesn't really matter. Todd essentially has infinite mana at this point. He's never going to miss a land drop. So Dylan was just trying to push Todd into trying to get rid of the Spell Snare over the Stifle, because I don't think Stifle has very many hits in Dylan's deck, if I'm not mistaken. But the Spell Snare definitely does have hits.
Yeah, I think like Stifle obviously has hits in Highlander against basically any deck. There'll always be something it can incidentally do, but it's not got too much that's really massive. It's just a fetch land or maybe a Liliana plus or something like that, which is just really not that big a deal.
And it exiles to Force of Will, which is what we're seeing here. So we did see Nihila almost make it to the battlefield and start generating a lot of advantage, but Todd wasn't having any of it. He decides to counter it.
I think Nihila might have ended up having to go under the Torrential Gearhulk, even if she had resolved, because Todd just has so much power on board.
Yeah, that's right. And what card are we looking at here?
I believe that is a Reckless Abandon, which is like Lightning Bolt, but you have to sacrifice a creature to cast it.
Ugh.
I could be wrong, but I believe that is the kind of the Dylan Kakawa Black-Red Aggro special.
The special.
They refuse to cut it no matter how many times I suggest that it should be cut.
It is better in the zombie build, admittedly, but you probably just have a lot better hits. In Singleton, when you're playing Burn, like... you can't play 4 lightning bolts. You can't play 4 incinerates. You have to kind of get a bit more creative. So I can see why Reckless Abandon could theoretically make it into Dylan's list. Although it will be good with the zombie interaction. Like you can just basically do it for free, which is what Dylan is doing now. But at the mere cost of 4 mana.
Only to establish dominance and ensure that they get to take their final life points and not Todd.
Which is very important, I think. Taking out those last points yourself is really a true sign of dominance. But going into sideboards now, on Dylan's side, we have Ancient Grudge, Bitter Blossom, Blood Moon, Curse Scroll, Duress, Gatekeeper of Malakir, Hymn to Torah, Kalidas, Trader of Get, Magus of the Moon, Necropotence, Phyrexian Obliterator, Syrian Blood, Smash the Smithereens and Sulfuric Vortex, and Thoughtseize. Phil, what do you feel that Dylan might be wanting to bring in on this matchup?
I think the really obvious ones would be Bitter Blossom, Curse Scroll, and the Sulfuric Vortex and the Necropotence. But there's also a couple of other cards that I think could come in depending on how much Dylan has that they want to take out.
Yeah.
So that'd be Duress, Hymn to Torah, Kalidas, Trader of Get, and Phyrexian Obliterator, as well as the Thoughtseize. So for the 2 creatures, it's really just that they're really hard for blue-red to deal with profitably once they're resolved. You can't
Especially
Kalidas
Obliterator, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Kalidas has 4 toughness, and so is hard to be killed with burn. And if you're directing a burn spell at a Phyrexian Obliterator, you're probably not winning the game.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are outs. You can counter it on its way down, or you can just bounce it back to the hand. But because of all the removal being in red, in the form of damage, Phyrexian Obliterator will possibly make its way into the sideboard. I did see it being still pushed through the sideboard, so maybe Dylan disagrees with us. However, they both have quite the opportunity for cards to take out, being that they're both playing some sort of moon effects is a way that they can kind of punk out other decks. But Dylan playing a Blood Moon in their sideboard, and I think are playing a Magus of the Moon in the main.
No, the Magus is sideboard.
Magus
as well.
is sideboard
I think
as
it's
well.
just the Price of Progress that's main.
Okay,
Which
sure.
I'm almost certain will feature in the main deck. It's a
very, very, very
pretty
good
potent
card.
card.
Well, yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if Todd was playing it in his main board as well. However, it appears that he's not just peeking over his list now, not playing the Price of Progress, but it's definitely a fantastic card, and I would not be upset to see it in any sort of red X deck.
Yeah,
in
a
the
lot
format.
of the control slower decks just kind of opt out of it because it doesn't do anything except sometimes win the game, and the control decks aren't trying to win the game until later on when they've established a kind of a commanding presence for most of their games.
That's
and
reasonable.
so you're not looking to. You don't want to put in a card into your deck where its only function is to steal a win from your opponent.
Yeah.
You want it to always be contributing to game plan A, which is control your opponent and then take over the late game.
Yeah, that's definitely reasonable. It seems on Todd's side he brought in engineer explosives and a couple of little burn spells, I think, just to sort of clear up that matchup, trying to bring in a little bit more spot removal, because hopefully, despite the recursion, you still can get a lot of value from just keeping the board clear for as long as possible.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of the recursion, kind of apart from, the cream of the crop Gravecrawler, a lot of it is stuff like Dread Wanderer or Bloodsow Champion that either you have to jump through a hoop to do it, or it costs a lot of mana, or both.
Yeah.
And a lot of the spot removal Todd is bringing in is, Pillar of Flame and Magma Spray, which do exile the creature when they kill it, as well as a sweeper in Anger of the Gods, which does that, as well as dealing with all the creatures, which is a pretty nice pull for Todd to be able to pull in from the sideboard.
Yeah, I don't think Dylan will be very excited to see any form of sweeper on Todd's side, but probably inevitable. That's why you sort of play card advantage engines and recursion and stuff in your aggro deck, because you're definitely going to expect some sort of sweeper. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, well, you usually expect kind of fewer or at least worse sweepers from the decks that aren't in white and or black.
Yeah.
After your Fiery Confluence and your Anger of the Gods, there's Sweltering Suns or Pyroclasm. You kind of maybe a Radiant Flames. You definitely run out of the really good options quite quickly.
Yeah. It looks like we're having a judge call at the moment, because poor Dylan looked at the top 2 cards of their deck as opposed to one when trying to initiate their ending scry, but we're going to have a judge come over and fix that up as soon as possible. But it's a little bit harder to... sometimes people can accidentally have a slip of the thumb, especially when they're on footage as well. But it just looked like Dylan meant to grab one card off the top of their library to have a little peek, and accidentally pulled 2 instead. But it seems to be a pretty easy fix for the judge. Just continue the scry as normal, except shuffle the other card away.
Yeah, I mean, you see it at just about every competitive RL event. At some point, someone will mean to look at one card and they'll look at 2. It's just a pretty easy thing for the sleeves to get stuck, or you kind of fumble a little bit and accidentally pick up more cards than you meant to.
Yeah, exactly. And we seem to have... Both players have kept their 6 by the looks of it, so Todd leading on a Mountain and Dylan following up with a Blood Crypt. So, the thing about Dylan's deck is that they're running a lot of black or black spells. Even especially post sideboard, we have Necropotence, especially in Dylan's hand. So even though you're a 2-color deck, you still have to be sort of aggressively fetching out those duels the best you can whenever you can, because you have to sort of cast red when you need to, and also black.
Yeah, the black especially. I know it's been a card. Barbarian Ring has been a card that's dipped in and out of a lot of people's lists, and pretty much the reason to not play the card is that it doesn't tap for black.
Sure.
Like obviously the card in a burn deck is an incredibly powerful tool in your arsenal. It's a piece of burn that's almost impossible to counter and takes up a slot in your lands rather than a slot in your spells.
Yeah.
But this deck is often so deep on the black plan that you sometimes don't play it.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. Trying to get that little bit of reach where you can is important, but I mean this BR aggro deck is basically the best of the best. It's the aggro deck that sort of held out the longest in the format, possibly along with Zoo in Naya and Jund, but Jund Zoo is basically just splashing green on a BR aggro deck,
Yeah, I think that this deck just has a lot of really low to the ground pieces and powerful engines behind what it's trying to do, that it kind of gets away with being an aggro deck in a format that doesn't really have very many of those.
Yeah, absolutely. We see the Harsh Mentor coming in. 2/2 for 2, not very good, but the 2/2 with the ability to sort of shock your opponent every time they try to activate a fetch land, or I think possibly in Todd's deck it's just the fetch lands that Harsh Mentor will be hitting. But
there's definitely a Riptide Laboratory.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, so recurring.
Probably also a Jace Friend's Prodigy, at a guess.
Sure. It's definitely reasonable. The Todd is definitely playing Jace Friend's Prodigy in his deck, but it's interesting because I know some green mages have been testing Rurik Armasaur, which is allows you to draw a card whenever an opponent activates an ability of a land or a creature. Maybe artifact as well, but it's basically Harsh Mentor, but you draw a card instead of an opponent taking damage, and it's just so much worse than what Harsh Mentor is doing.
I think it's not to do, I think, with the damage or the card draw. I think that in a vacuum, drawing a card is probably better than 2 damage in a lot of ways and in a lot of matchups. I think the main downside to the Armasaur is just that it costs another mana.
Yeah.
And so it's much
That's
easier
reasonable
for your opponent to kind of have all of their fetching out of the way by the time it's coming down.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is a really good card against particularly aggressive decks, just because it's a 2/5, which is pretty hard to beat through and a lot harder to remove than the Harsh Mentor. But yeah, it was definitely a card that was talked about a lot upon spoiling, and then kind of didn't really see as much play as some people had anticipated.
Yeah, which is very unfortunate. But Liliana, on the other hand, never disputed as a fantastic card to be playing. So we'll see if Todd has the answer for it. By the looks of this fetch, it looks like we might be able to see it resolve, which is good. Dylan's preemptively ticked Liliana up as a show of dominance, although they may have let it resolve. But it looks like Todd might be doing something in response to at least the tick up. And yeah, it looks like we're just going to allow it to resolve, which is such a huge game for Dylan. I think they'll be pretty happy to keep that Liliana on the battlefield as long as possible.
Yeah, I mean, Dylan's sitting on just the one card in hand here, which I believe, if I remember from the opening hands correctly, is a Necropotence. So if Dylan can kind of navigate themselves into a situation where this card off the top can be cast at the same time as Necropotence, whether it's a one drop or a land, you can end up with no cards in hand and a Necropotence in play, which is fantastic. You could also lead with the Liliana Plus, depending on what the additional card is, to try and maybe bait out a response from your opponent on just the Liliana Plus, and increase your chance of the Necropotence resolving if the additional card isn't particularly useful to your plan, and doesn't really matter in the long run. There's anything from a brainstorm to I think a dig through time. Todd has just enough cards. He could do that. You could just hope that your opponent dies up a bit of their mana in that, and you increase your chance of Necropotence getting through.
Yeah, I mean, Necropotence will be a huge game for if it manages to get through. So I think they're heavily incentivized to try and bait out anything they possibly can with this Liliana. And looks like it's worked, because Todd's going to opt to draw 2 cards before he's forced into discarding 1. So it seems to be an okay decision on Todd's part. I mean, he's not doing anything anyway. He may as well do it now, I guess. But there's definitely a consideration that he likes all the cards in his hand so much that he would risk dig through timing now. Whereas probably the best time to dig through time, if you have the option, was just at the end of the turn.
Well, I think the decision from Todd here is kind of based on the assumption that Dylan only has 2 cards in hand, 1 after this Liliana Plus is finished resolving.
Yeah.
So there's so few things that you'll get really severely punished by.
Yeah.
Because, obviously the card that Dylan's running out has to be equivalent or better in card quality to your entire hand plus the best 2 of those 7 cards because of the dig through time.
Yeah.
Todd's just unlucky in that is exactly the situation that Dylan's found themselves in, because Necropotence is a pretty unfair Magic card.
Yeah, it doesn't really see very much play in nearly every format. I mean, I believe it's only legal in Vintage and maybe some sort of oddball other formats, but it's just so incredibly powerful. For anyone who doesn't know, you skip your draw step and then you can pay 1 life in your end step to draw 1 card, and you can do that as many times as you want while you're still in your end step. And then so you basically pay 7 mana, pay 7 life, go up to 7 cards in your end step, and then just continue to have between 5 and 7 cards for the rest of the game, depending on how your life total goes. But in an aggro deck, it's pretty gosh darn fantastic, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's some extra steps. You exile the cards from your library face down, and then you put them into your hand in your end step.
Sure.
It also has the text that if you discard a card, you exile it rather than putting it into your graveyard.
It makes it a little bit more fair.
Yeah, that clearly balances the card entirely. I mean, Dylan's getting punished by it right now with this Liliana Plus. Going to have to exile one of those cards instead of discarding it, which is really just a travesty. I'm sure they've only got, at least 2 spare lands to throw into the garbage.
Yeah, that's right.
Just don't matter.
But we're seeing a fact or fiction here again from Todd's side in response to the Liliana tick up. So I'm still not 100% sure about this line. I mean, Todd's a very competent Magic player, so I'm assuming that he's playing on a higher state of being than I could ever imagine. But in response to the Liliana, just to find extra cards to get that sort of card advantage, you're probably inclined to just take the 3 no matter what it is, so that you have more fuel for Liliana.
Yeah, well, I think that you can't get punished by tapping out and having Dylan resolve Necropotence, because that's already happened.
Yeah. The worst has already happened.
So I think that you just... I mean, I don't know if I necessarily agree with the fact or fiction there, but I'm not sure exactly what other tools Todd had at his disposal. I mean, there's probably some decent reasons to do that. We're in a situation where Todd's avenue to winning the game is probably doing what I said Control doesn't want to do, and stealing a win with a few cheeky burn spells.
Yeah.
If Dylan puts their life total just a few points too low with that Necropotence.
I don't think Dylan's very scared of that Die-Fleet Daredevil that Todd did get off the top with the Fact or Fiction, because there's not very much in that graveyard, if I'm not mistaken. Just a Harsh Mentor and a few lands.
No, I don't think there's any spells at the moment, but it's certainly something to keep in mind, because if you're sitting on something like a Lava Spike or a Lightning Bolt you want to put into the face, or whatever it might be, letting your opponent then have that off the Direfleet Daredevil and kind of pointing it back at your face definitely makes it a lot harder for you to win the race against your own necropotence plus a few burn spells.
Yeah. Dylan, no fear for the fiery confluence that could be imminent playing out. Possibly, playing out the Skull Clamp and then playing out all these creatures. It could be pretty bad news for poor Dylan if Todd does find that sweeper.
Well, I mean, even Fiery Confluence, it would deal with the Deathrite and the Diagraph Ghoul, and then one of Skullclamp and Keldon Marauders.
Mm-hmm.
So you've still got, the other of Skullclamp and Keldon Marauders, as well as a Liliana on 6 and the Necropotence.
Yeah, okay, that's
and
reasonable.
7 cards in hand still. So it might only be 6 if Dylan's on 7, but it's a lot of cards.
No shortage of cards. I think they're happy with just keeping the 4 cards that they have left over with two lands and a Spawn of Mayhem and another card that I can't quite make out.
I believe it's Riftbolt.
Okay, cool. So still a lot of damage that Dylan has in hand. Probably enough to not draw any more cards with Necropotence, although the benefit is that you can if you want, so Dylan will have as many choices as they desire.
Yeah, well, you just... I think the logic here was that Dylan just wanted to stay at 7 because 6 is Bolt, Snapcaster Bolt, or, a line like that, whereas 7 is 3 burn spells, not 2, which is just a little bit more of a safety net to work with.
Absolutely, that's a good point.
No reason to kind of throw away the game when you're in a pretty commanding position, as long as you don't do anything, really stupid.
Yeah. I mean, Dylan will have to do something pretty silly to get themselves out of such a commanding lead. But I mean, stranger things have happened. There's still a bunch of cards in Todd's hand, and there's still a bunch of actions that can still be taken. But with Liliana at ultimate range, Todd will have to do something, and it looks like the Electrolyze is the line that they're going to choose.
Yeah, well, it's just keeping the Liliana off ultimating, and then electing to Magma Spray away the Keldon Marauders. Unfortunately for Todd, it is a leaves the battlefield trigger on the Marauders, not a dice trigger, so you're still going to get a cheeky point of damage in.
Yeah.
But, Dylan is actually on a kind of low life total in comparison to Todd, so the thought of losing the game to a few random burn spells has definitely got to be at the forefront of their mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Strip Mine making quick work of the steam vents that Todd has, being the although they do have a choice of any of the lands being Strip Mine, allowing to destroy basics and non-basics. Just trying to constrain the amount of spells that Todd can play while Dylan gets ahead seems to be very reasonable.
Yeah, this deck was a huge beneficiary of the recent removal of a point of Strip Mine, because it's only ever been trying to use Strip Mine as a way to gather tempo and kind of keep your opponent off dealing with your incredibly cheap threats. Something like a turn 1 drop, turn 2 1-drop plus Strip Mine was the goal. And
yeah.
I think previously the deck was forced to choose between Wasteland plus a point or playing the Strip Mine, but between the unpointing of Skullclamp down to 1 a few points updates ago, and then the recent change to Strip Mine, you can now play basically all the points you'd ever want. You can play Jet, and then you can still play Wasteland, Strip Mine, Skullclamp, and Umazala Jide.
That's pretty fantastic, yeah.
It's pretty horrifying.
Yeah. It feels a lot more fair when you're dying to a Strip Mine if it's only hitting you once. I mean, that was something that was heavily discussed in the recent points update, was that... here we go with the Liliana Ultimate. Some of the thing that was recently discussed was that, like, Strip Mine versus Wasteland is such a small difference when you're not recurring them every turn.
Yeah. Well, in a deck like Black Red Aggro, it's almost the same thing, really, because you're incentivized to target whatever land on your opponent's side of the battlefield is the best, which will usually be either a non-basic utility land or the land that taps for the most colors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, there's situations in which your opponent starts off on a basic and then you want to strip mine them, but you're also trying to develop your board state early in this aggro deck, so sometimes you hold off on the strip mine until like a turn 2 or turn 3 or even 4. And so while obviously strip mine is a better card, the margins when there's no crucible and no life from the loam, it's pretty narrow.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like Dylan's happy with having 0 cards for the rest of the game, or at least for the next couple of turns, considering Todd's down to 2 lands from that Liliana ultimate, which is interesting that Todd chose the blue lands over the red lands, considering he has a Fiery Confluence in hand. I mean, we're still pretty far away from casting Fiery Confluence, but not impossible. We could rip a couple of lands in the next turn or 2.
Well, Dylan's sitting on 5 damage a turn, 2 of which can't be blocked from the Deathrite Shaman.
Yeah.
So I think that trying to cast Fiery Confluence is a lost cause.
Sure.
I think that basically you're choosing between either being able to still cast the Mana Leak that you have in hand, or sticking with the mountains and hoping Dylan puts himself lower off the Necropotence, and then between Vendilion Clique attack plus a burn spell, you can steal the game.
Yeah.
I think I probably would go with the second line, but I think that there's certainly merit to kind of still being able to interact with your opponent and not putting all of your faith in the top of your deck.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, Brainstorm was the draw for Todd, and he did see 3 lands, which is very funny. But Dylan made the decision much easier for Todd by saying, "I also have this burn spell in my hand."
Yeah, sometimes your opponent just has all of these.
Yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately, you have a lowly 2 islands because you've been Liliana of the Veiled out of the game.
Oh dear, yeah. So it makes it an exciting going into round 3. With Dylan and Todd making minimal sideboard changes, although Dylan is making some sideboard changes. Sometimes there's a play-draw difference, or sometimes the matchup a little bit better. But, I mean, Todd seems to be keeping it relatively simple. I think he's taken out that back to basics, possibly replacing with something else. I don't mind back to basics at all against BR aggro, but you probably just have more influential things to play.
Yeah, I think it's just a question of what else you can do. The deck is pretty basic light. It's usually running somewhere around between 2 and 4, all of which typically are swamps.
Mm-hmm.
So you can be pretty incentivized to play back to basics. Blood Moon is obviously not great, because your opponent can still cast all of their red spells, even if, If there was somehow a way to have a Blood Moon in play for 0 mana and it didn't cost you a card, then you take it, because it does make their life very, very slightly harder.
Yeah,
but it's certainly not worth the mana in the card.
Not worth the real estate.
But Back to Basics has a little bit more pull in that it does stop a huge number of lands from untapping if you can land it pretty early.
Yeah,
that can really negate the aggro player's desire to advance their board state. But Todd's just opting to have a bit more of a consistent answer rather than hoping that the back to basics lines up right. And he gets that.
I think even if you do play back to basics on turn 3, which I don't think Todd has any way to play it any earlier, but if you play back to basics on turn 3, Dylan's pretty much done everything that they could. The deck can go long, granted, but half your hand will probably be on the battlefield by the second turn. By the third turn, it's not really that big of an issue.
Sure, but if you're also kind of stopping your opponent from really having any more draw steps, or if they just had a hand that was slightly more expensive than turn 1 1-drop, turn 2 2 1-drops, then you definitely can get value out of it. But
yeah. Well, we'll see how Dylan's hand does line up. It appears that they are definitely considering their 7. Todd swiftly putting away and trying to go up to 6. So, I mean, only time will tell if the 6 is any better, but Dylan seems to be pretty content with the 7 cards that they have face down on the table at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a couple of lands and a couple of spells, and that's usually what you want. Yeah. There's certainly some decks that have existed through Magic's time that don't always want a couple of lands and a couple of spells. It's usually the more combo decks that want kind of specific sets of spells and things like that. But for these kind of more traditional or consistent decks, you're pretty much happy with just about any combination of spells.
Yeah, absolutely. And here we're seeing the Electrolyze for the third game in a row possibly making an appearance, but looks like Todd's going to keep that 6. It looks pretty good. I mean, Engine Explosives could be a good game if it comes down at the right time and for the right amount.
Yeah, I mean, it's also Todd's just in the nice position of basically all of the cards in his hand cost 2 or less. So even if he does miss on his land drops for a little while from this point, he still has a couple of tools to participate in this game. This Jace could help smooth out some draw spells, some draws, and help find those lands. There's a young Pyromancer in hand that could definitely gum up the board and make some blockers. He's definitely got some tools with which he can participate in this game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's if it was any 6, it would be very close to the 6 that Todd had if we were going to tie up this game by finishing off from game 3. But I mean, some sideboard cards and Electrolyze, it's probably just going to be good enough. But we'll see what Dylan's packing could make the situation a little bit harder for Todd.
Yeah, I mean, having less cards than your opponent just from pre-game actions is never a good feeling. Particularly when it kind of always even feels worse when you're on the play, and then you're kind of playing 6 against 8 cards rather than 6 against 7.
Yeah,
like you might kind of suspect, but there's definitely ways that Todd can positively interact. This young Pyromancer is definitely
one of them.
Yeah, while the creatures on Dylan's side of the board can be recurred from the graveyard, if that's what they're spending their mana doing every turn against a horde of 1/1 elementals, Todd's I'm sure would be absolutely thrilled with that occurring.
Yeah, even if it eats a burn spell, it's like not the worst thing in the world. I mean, Jace Venom's Prodigy did eat a Chain Lightning from Dylan's side, but I think if you can keep the Pyromancer around for as long as possible, you're going to be pretty happy. Just because most of Dylan's aggression does come from creatures, so being able to supply a swarm of being able to supply a swarm of 1/1s could be the way to victory for Todd, but not in the face of this Geth's Verdict, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Just a target player sacrifices a creature, loses a life for black at instant speed.
Okay.
It's just the deck elects to play that over something like Diabolic Edict because making your opponent lose a life is better than not making them lose a life.
Yeah, and you can always afford that black, especially when you sort of built your deck around being able to make black or black.
Yeah, I mean every land that Dylan controls taps for black, so
pretty much perfect for him. We're going to see an Engine Explosives X1, which is definitely fine. It's a little bit early to be wanting to do that too much, but by missing Todd's land drop twice in a row, he's probably okay with just punching this off as soon as possible to try and stem at least some of the bleeding, being already on 4 life.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he would have much preferred to cast it and crack it in the same turn, or just run out that Electrolyze and get value that way, but didn't really have a choice. He's kind of got to hope he hits this land drop and can somehow use that to salvage the game. He has hit the land drop, so it's certainly a start.
Yeah, I think he does have a Chain Lightning in hand, which is a bit daunting in front of these 2 mountains, or 2 lands that tap for red, but he doesn't really have a choice at this point. He's going to try and pop it and see if Dylan finds the line, and he does. Very expert playing. I mean, Todd seemed to have one out there, which was hopefully Dylan doesn't notice that Chain Lightning has extra text, but fortunately, I think Dylan's played a Chain Lightning or 2 before, and
I don't think so. I mean, that's probably the first Chain Lightning Dylan's ever seen in their life.
I could definitely agree with that. Well, there we go, and that's our final round of Swiss round 7. So if you want to check out the full event, you can just by checking through this current playlist that we're in. But that is all we have for the 2019 CANCON Australian Highlander Championships, hosted by GoodGames and the Games Capital. So thank you so much for both of them and all the players who joined and got to go on footage. It was a fantastic event, and please stay tuned for the Legacy event that was the day after, and then the Modern event, which was on the day after that. So thank you so much. My name has been Angus Mackay, and we've been joined by Phil Nicholson.
That's me.
And we'll see you next time.